Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of our spring webinar series that is going to be presented to you by Autism Society of the San Francisco Bay Area. My name is Feda Maliti. I'm the Vice President of the Autism Society, and joining me today is...
I'm Christina Moretto. I'm the Secretary of the Autism Society.
And we're both very pleased to introduce Amy Westling, who's the Executive Director of ARCA, which is the Association of Regional Center Agencies. Amy used to be at Disability Rights California and at Alta Regional Center, and now she is currently the Executive Director of ARCA. ARCA is an agency that represents 21 independent regional centers throughout the state of California, and they both advocate and coordinate services for approximately 350,000 clients with developmental disabilities. Without further ado, well, actually first, let me do some housekeeping, guys. So everyone that's online right now is on mute. So if you have a question, please type it into the question bar, and Christina and I will be monitoring those. Also, if you're on the phone, you're going to have to write your questions in to info@sfautismsociety.org. The webinar is being recorded, so if you have to get up, do something, or if you need to leave early, don't worry about it. It should be up soon once the broadcast is over, and you'll get an email letting you know that it's available for you to watch again or share. So we're going to have Amy first do her presentation, and then we'll go into Q&A. All right, without further ado, go ahead, Amy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Feda. And thank you all for joining us this morning for this discussion about how policy is driven and how it impacts real people's lives. As Feda mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the Association of Regional Center Agencies. I've been working in this field for quite a long time and worked for not only Alta California Regional Center, but also Central Valley Regional Center and Disability Rights California when it was known as Protection and Advocacy Incorporated. I bring a lot of passion to this field and really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning. Next slide.
All right, there you go.
Looks like it didn't change.
Yeah, it didn't change.
That's amazing.
Okay, thanks so much. So today we're going to talk about three things in pretty high level, and then we'll have the opportunity to do some Q&A at the end, and really do appreciate the opportunity to spend some time answering the questions that matter most to you. But first, we're going to talk about big, broad systems issues that are driving developmental services. Second, kind of those shorter term things that, quite frankly, are the things that wake me up at night and make me think about, okay, the next things I need to do this week, this month, and this year. And then finally, how we can all work together to meet individual and overall needs. Next slide.
Wow, sorry, I don't know what is going on. Is it changing?
Yes,
the times are changing. Okay, here we go.
So are the times. So really this first section is going to talk about some of those big policy issues that are driving changes in developmental services today. Next slide. I'm sure you all are aware of the Hcbs final rule. This is an initiative that the federal government approved in 2014 and really is aimed at pushing developmental services systems as well as other long-term services and supports for seniors and other identified populations to a different place. Back in the 1960s, regional centers were developed in large response to not only parent advocacy in the state of California here, but also in response to the federal push to think differently about how to support people with developmental disabilities outside of institutional settings. And now that we've hit a place where institutional settings are no longer the norm, and where we are a largely and almost totally community-based system, the federal government is really pushing us to think about the next steps. So there are, as you're probably well aware, there are expectations around what's called the settings rule, which is the piece of the Hcbs final rule that gets the most attention. And that's about how to move people into greater levels of inclusion and integration in their communities. There is a lot of attention, of course, also being paid to person-centered planning, which the federal government, when they issue rules and regulations, they're always very long and almost incomprehensible at times. But they defined person-centered planning essentially as striking a balance between what's important to someone and for them. Those things that are important for health and safety, but also those things that are related to what that individual defines as making life worth living, and really encouraging us and urging us, as well as other states, to come into compliance with the expectation that we do an analysis of that balance for each person. Conflict-free case management. Here in California, we have always had a regional center system, at least in the last 50 years, that makes decisions and works with the planning team around the acquisition of services, but regional centers themselves don't provide direct services. Other states, their case management agency were oftentimes also service providers, and so the federal government wanted to see a separation between the two, and each state was required to come up with a plan for how they're going to transition their current system to meet the new federal expectations by 2022. Next slide.
Actually, really quickly, can you just explain what Hcbs is for anybody who doesn't know what that is and why that's important?
Absolutely. So Hcbs stands for the Home and Community-Based Services, and at its core, it is the mechanism that is used to fund developmental services around the country. So when the regional center system started in the 1960s, the late 1960s, there was no federal participation for the services regional centers provide, or any other state-based, community-based systems. And over time, the federal government came to see that it was more cost-effective and more person-centered to maintain people in communities rather than in institutional settings. And so they created what was called the Home and Community-Based Services Waivers, which provide states with an opportunity to recoup federal funds for services they provide in the community. For example, here in the state of California, I think in the next year, it's expected that our service system, the regional center service system, and the services that we purchase as well, will draw down about $3 billion of federal funds in the next year. And
this is for California alone.
That's for California alone. And no federal dollars come without expectations, and those expectations are called the Hcbs, or Home and Community-Based Services Rule.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Okay, one of the big initiatives here in the state of California right now is trying to figure out how to make life simpler and more streamlined for people who receive services from a variety of agencies. Our current administration here in Sacramento, which is of course overseen by Governor Newsom, has a real focus on simplifying and streamlining service delivery for the average person, and particularly for people that receive services from a variety of service sectors. So for example, if you think about the Medi-Cal system, Medi-Cal is actually the system through which regional centers get a lot of their funding. But Medi-Cal also pays for health services, they pay for dental services, they pay for mental health services, and they pay for them all through a variety of different agencies. So one of the initiatives being undertaken right now is called Medi-Cal Healthier California for All. And up until a couple weeks ago, they were calling this initiative CalAIM. And really, in the realm of medical, dental, and psychiatric services, the question that's being asked is, how can we streamline the service delivery so that people aren't having to run from one agency to another to get the services they need? If you think about a child with a developmental disability who perhaps needs sedation dentistry services in a hospital setting, if that child is on Medi-Cal, you have to secure in the current system an authorization for the dental services through Denti-Cal, and then you have to secure a separate authorization through Medi-Cal for the operating room and anesthesia services. One of the goals of this is to help streamline and flatten out that system to see if there's opportunities to make it easier for people to access. Additionally, there's what's called the California Master Plan for Aging. This is an initiative looking at, in the senior community, how do we as a state, again, streamline service delivery? So one of the big areas that they're looking at, and one of the big focus areas that interest me in particular, is related to the delivery of in-home supportive services. And one of the things that they are looking at is, what do we do about the shortage of caretakers for not only the elderly population, but also other people who rely on caretakers, like people with disabilities. And then finally, the Developmental Services Task Force. The Department of Developmental Services, in response to the current year's budget, was instructed to do some work with the Developmental Services Task Force. This has been a body that began in, I think, 2013. It was known as the Developmental Centers Task Force, and its initial goal was to figure out, what do we do with the developmental centers and how do we help transition to a more community-based system. When the plan to close the developmental centers was issued, the task force was renamed the Developmental Services Task Force, and some additional members were added, but in large part it remained a very similar structure. So this year, the Department of Developmental Services put out an application and has expanded the membership of the task force from 21 to 156 individuals between the task force and its work groups. Next slide. So many people may wonder, what is the Developmental Services Task Force supposed to be doing? It's supposed to examine, and this is from some of the budget language from this current year, how to create a sustainable, innovative, cost-effective, consumer-focused, and outcomes-based service delivery system. So it's really taking those elements and thinking about, where does our service system go from here? How do we make sure that the services we're providing are done with kind of those focuses in mind? One of the other things it will be doing is identifying key consumer outcomes. At the inception of our system, the consumer outcomes were pretty understandable, and we could kind of see what they were pretty clearly. So one of them was to move people out of institutional settings, particularly developmental centers. In 1969, the state of California had 13,500 people in state developmental centers, with a wait list for parents who had put their children on the wait list and wanted to get them in. So of course, the big focus was to move people into community-based settings and to keep new people from going in. And one of the ways we did that was to also focus on maintenance of children, minor children, at home with their families. But now that, you know, over 99% or so of children remain in home settings, either with their families or guardians, and you know, we have just a small handful of people in the developmental centers who are there for temporary stays. We're starting to think through, what are the next things? What are those big audacious goals? And that'll be some of the work of the Developmental Services Task Force. And then, of course, the task force is charged with evaluating and planning for compliance with the federal rules. And that goes back to the Hcbs final rule that we were talking about previously, because California has long had an interest in helping people to lead as integrated of lives as possible. But with the additional pressure of the federal government, particularly as it relates to funding, it's one of the things we really need to keep on the radar. And so the administration and the legislature were clear about that as well. Next slide. The here and now. Here are the things that really are right in front of us today, and that we really need to think about in terms of those next things that we really need to deal with in the next year or so. Next slide. One of the big things that we know is that as the developmental centers closed, that we needed to figure out a way to ensure that people that were in the community and had a way to get their needs met. While no one really liked the idea of putting people into developmental centers, at least over the last few decades, they served as a backstop, if you will. They served as a place where if the community was really struggling to support someone could be referred to a developmental center. The instances in which we can refer people to developmental centers today are very limited and are usually related to having been found incompetent to stand trial for an alleged crime. So the community really has used the developmental center closures as an opportunity to develop additional supports for people with significant medical needs, those with significant psychiatric needs, and those with significant behavioral needs. There's some additional new models of care that came out of the developmental center closures. For instance, adult residential facilities for persons with specialized healthcare needs to meet some of those intensive medical needs, up to and including people on ventilators. Psychiatric, there are a lot of services that are being developed and have been developed related to individuals with psychiatric and behavioral needs, for instance, and it's kind of a continuum of services ranging from mobile crisis services to enhanced behavioral supports homes to community crisis homes. And the state continues to play a role for some individuals in what are called the STAR facilities, which are short-term acute behavioral treatment facilities, really that have an eye towards moving people back into the community as quickly as possible. And there's also been a number of services designed to help ease that transition back to the community for people that do have to use a restrictive service at some point. One of the other focuses of this administration is finding a way to ensure that we are meeting the needs of multi-agency children, particularly those whose lives are touched by regional centers, special education, the mental health system, as well as the child welfare system. Next slide. Of course, one of the challenges that our system faces is money. This system is growing incredibly quickly. We are anticipated in the next budget year to increase from about 350,000 individuals supported by the system to nearly 370,000, an increase of about 18,000 people. And so just that growth means that from a fiscal perspective, more money is entering the system. But because of the way that California is structured in terms of our budget system and in terms of the way money flows into the state coffers, we're very, very reliant as a state on personal income tax and very reliant on the personal income tax proceeds from those with the most resources. And this is a funding stream that tends to fluctuate depending on market conditions and those kinds of things to a much higher degree than other sources such as property taxes. So what this means is that California has in its state budget kind of booms and busts, right? We don't have just little blips typically. We tend to either times are really good or times are really bad. And so finding a way to adjust for that has meant that over the years, what start out as temporary restrictions in funding in our service system and a lot of other service systems, to be fair, turn out to be longer term issues. So service provider rates, so rates for those vendors that provide the day-to-day services for people that regional centers support, have gotten really stale. And there was a rate study that I'm sure you're aware of that was completed, actually the final results were posted just this month, that really highlighted that this system and its service providers are underfunded by about $1.8 billion. Now the state invested about $400 million of that last year, but there's still a big gap there. And really, that's one of the significant challenges. Similarly, funding for regional center operations has grown incredibly stale over the years. And this is the key reason that regional centers really are not able to comply with expected caseload ratios, which has a whole effect on the system as a whole. It makes it so that, you know, families don't get the level of attention that they may need, and that service providers may not get the level of coordination they need. And it's a problem we're acutely aware of and actively working to identify additional funding for. In the state of California, it's incredibly expensive to do business, so we find that oftentimes on both the service provider and regional center side, there are unfunded or underfunded mandates, which causes questions about how to sustain the system going forward. We're nearly a $10 billion a year system now, and how to build capacity for the 18,000 new people we're going to serve in the next year and the 18,000 people that we're going to serve in the following year. It's just a system that continues to grow very, very quickly. Next slide. So the governor released his budget, his proposed budget, on January 10th. And prior to that, back in October, ARCA sat down with our regional center leaders and really talked about what are some things that we would be thrilled to see in the governor's budget, and began advocating for those things. One of them was getting rid of parental fees in Early Start. So the Family Cost Participation Program and the annual family program fee. What we hear from families is that while these programs may not cost a lot, that they are a barrier to service. And we know that the earlier we can get into serving young children, the better off everybody is. We had noted that two services, independent living services and infant development programs, were not given rate increases last year because of some challenges identified in the rate study. So we advocated for them to receive rate increases as well, which is proposed in the governor's budget. Service coordination funding, at this time, the regional centers are somewhere between 700 and 800 service coordinators short statewide. You know, there is statute that tells us what the caseload ratio should be, and we're not hitting that mark. And so we were seeking funding for that. And then one of the other things that we were working with the Lanterman Coalition, which is a group that represents providers and advocacy groups and a bunch of other facets of our service delivery system, was around encouraging and pushing for an implementation plan for the rate study recommendations that came out last spring. Next slide. In terms of the rate study, I've kind of covered these big points already. It was finalized in January, and it provides some great opportunities around serving diverse communities, providing services to help people find jobs, and rewarding staff who have greater levels of experience and training with higher wages if fully implemented. Next slide. As I mentioned, the governor's budget was kicked off in January. January 10th was a big day. You can see that kind of theme passing through. And in the governor's budget, we were pleased to see a number of things. So the rate increases that were approved last budget year had a proposed, or had a potential sunset date of December 31st, 2021. Those sunset dates have been moved now to June 30th, 2023, so that 18-month extension is certainly appreciated. There was additional funding proposed to reduce caseload ratios for children who are ages 3 and 4 in the regional center system. As I mentioned, there were a couple of additional rate increases for those programs that got left out of those last year. There was some additional investment in the safety net proposed in 2 areas. First, for people who are needing services of competency restoration for those who have been found incompetent to stand trial. But also there is a pilot program being piloted right now in San Diego and San Andreas regional centers that really is a preventative clinical response program to try to maintain people in their homes rather than to allow situations to hit crisis levels. And there's a proposed expansion of that to 4 additional regional center areas. Regional centers right now operate on a counting system that was built in the mid-80s, and it has a lot of trouble sometimes cutting checks to service providers. So there's the proposal to begin the process to replace that. And there's what's called the Performance Incentive Program, which is a set of dollars to allow for some creative projects in local areas to try to push consumer outcomes, and the areas that were identified in the budget included around employment and service to diverse communities and a few others. So really an opportunity for some more flexible spending than we've seen in years. Next slide. I just never want to leave one of these presentations without noting just how much everyone in this service system has in common. You know, I think it's really easy at times to focus on what's not going right, what the challenges are. Next slide, sorry. What the challenges are, but really at the end of the day, we're looking for, and I think, you know, enjoy working with people served by regional centers as well as their families, service providers, advocates, all in the pursuit of safety, security, support, growth, meeting individuals' unique needs, and achieving the highest levels of independence possible. Next slide. One of the things that we know from the regional center system is we can't do this work in a vacuum. We rely on community partners and partnerships with families and people directly served by the regional centers to provide people with those things that are not only federal expectations, but the expectations of the people being supported related to service coordination, person-centered planning, ensuring equitable access to services, ensuring that people have access to the direct services that they need, and really working to ensure that those services meet quality expectations and that we as a system are advancing and improving every day. Next slide, please. Oh,
Go ahead, Christina.
Thank you very much, Amy. I think that Feda has a comment before we move to the questions.
Yeah, so it's a comment and it's something that I've heard before, and a lot of parents have asked me about it as well. So there's two different budgets or two different funding streams that come into the regional center. And you touched on it. You said there's an operations budget and there's also kind of the service budget or the POS budget, correct?
yes.
Okay. So we definitely need.
Would you like me to explain a little more about that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So regional centers, as Feda mentioned, receive two distinct kind of buckets, if you will, of money. One is the one that takes up about almost 90% of the regional center's budget is for paying service providers to provide those daily supports to people. And that's known as the purchase of service budget. So when we talk about service provider rates and we talk about vendors or contractors, we're talking about all that same thing. That is that bucket of money, which is by far the largest piece. And then the other piece is known as the ops or operations budget. And that's what funds the staffing of the regional center. And regional centers really have a few very clear mandates of things they're expected to do with that money. The most visible and most obvious is service coordination, but they are also charged with doing intake and assessment. So making sure that people that enter the system receive a good clinical evaluation and deciding and discerning who qualifies and who doesn't under our legal standards. And then they also are responsible for contracting with service providers for what's called vendorizing them. And they are responsible for paying for their services, as I mentioned, with that 90% of the budget. They are also responsible for making sure that the services that are provided qualify for federal reimbursement. As we talked about, the system relies on about 40% federal dollars. And so regional centers really play a huge role in making sure that people, that the services people receive qualify for federal reimbursement so we can get a lot of those dollars back into the state.
Okay, so I guess my question then is this. So my understanding is every year the operation budget gets completely utilized, but the service budget or the money that's supposed to be spent on regional center consumers, that comes in based on, you know, amounts from the previous year, but much of that money gets sent back because the money is not used for services because there aren't enough service providers.
Right. And
a lot
that
of people don't know that, I think, and I think it's really important to know that there is money in the budget for services. We just don't have service providers to be able to serve our children.
And when I talk with service providers, you know, one of the challenges that we have, remember I referenced that during times of recession or financial challenges in California, policy gets made in response to that moment in time. And then that policy tends to kind of hang on for a while. One of the, there are two distinct policies that made it really much harder to develop enough service providers. One of them is rate freezes. So regional centers don't have the ability to independently adjust service providers' rates as the costs of service go up. So you'll see oftentimes big pushes for additional funding for service providers, and that's because those decisions have to be made through the state budget process. The second thing that happened was there were limitations placed on the funding, on the rates that regional centers could negotiate with providers who were doing especially the most innovative programs. This was known as the median rate rule. And basically, there was an analysis done of how much each regional center, how much their median, so their midpoint rate for each service. And then the policy said, okay, regional centers, we're going to also calculate the statewide median rate. And whichever is lower, that's the rate that you, individual regional center, get to use going forward. So we're always kind of playing this catch-up game in terms of being capped at rates that don't support the development of new programs. And that's the biggest reason that you will see purchase of service dollars turned back, and that you see that in many cases there aren't enough service providers to meet the identified needs.
What authority does, or what can regional centers, because they're all independent and they operate differently, and what can they do to work, to provide services in the area? Because we know that there are, you might be able to get respite, I'm not going to talk about quality, in maybe say somewhere in the Central Valley, and that respite rate might work, that median rate. But if you're in Palo Alto, no one's going to go to Palo Alto to provide respite for your kid. So how can, for example, if it's okay for Central Valley to pay a certain rate, is there something that, say, SARC can do where they can create a code or do something to be able to provide services for their clients? Because what's happening is clients are simply not getting services.
Totally hear you. And, ARCA has been a strong proponent of getting rid of the median rates for that very reason. And, at times the way that rate setting works does disadvantage service providers in high cost areas. And so, while there is some flexibility in service codes, there are some service codes that are pretty carefully defined in regulations, and you're not supposed to, as a regional center, use what are known as miscellaneous service codes, which have a lot more freedom. You're not supposed to use those in lieu of an established service code. So this is one of the big challenges in the system, is how do we as a system try to develop enough resources to meet the needs of not only the people already enrolled in the system in service delivery, but also the needs of people who really are entering the system for the first time.
Thank you for that. So another looming issue that we have is housing. So with all of the development center closures, what is our safety net? It seems that there is no room at group homes, particularly for the severely disabled with dangerous behaviors. My son is extremely violent and it is not safe for me to live with him, but what are my options? And are enhanced behavioral homes taking new clients, and how can I get my son in? If I have a 2-bedroom addition to my home with its own entrance.
That's one question. First answer that one.
Okay. Do that one first. Sorry.
Okay. Remember I said January 10th was a big date for us. One of the other things that was released on that date, so we had the governor's budget, the update to the rate study. The department also released an update to its safety net plan. You can find it on the department's website, which really highlights where we as a state are in terms of meeting the needs of people, in terms of those who need to access the safety net. There are a continuum of services in terms of how we can support people who have intensive behavioral needs. You know, that starts with a conversation with the service coordinator. It may involve a referral to mobile crisis service. It may involve exploration of placement in any number of settings. You know, lots of people know about enhanced behavioral support homes because we talk about them in legislative hearings, but many areas of the state also have what are known as specialized residential facilities, which is a little lower level of home that may meet the need. Some people's intensive needs are met in kind of enhanced supported living services. And in some instances, individuals with the most intensive support needs are referred for an assessment to determine if they really need a community crisis home or a state-run crisis facility to kind of get a handle on what's going on and then transition back to the community. But it all starts with that conversation with the service coordinator about where you are as a family and what options are available. We also do know that some of those resources, because they are so very specialized, are concentrated in just a few places in the state. So, you know, at times I will hear from families that say, here's the need I have, and they may not be open to their loved one even temporarily going someplace else in the state. So it all is a balancing act in terms of what services your loved one needs, what services your family needs, and how we can support people in their home communities. And it may be that the answer is that the service that they need today isn't the service that they're going to need tomorrow or the next day. It could be that, you know, somebody needs a community crisis home today, and then they can step down to an enhanced behavioral supports home. And it may be that that's the level of care they need long term, but it's all individualized, and there are more enhanced behavioral supports homes being developed each year.
Is there a list of, or something that says, this is what an enhanced support, you know, behavioral home is. This is what a crisis home is. These are the type of clients they take, because you just said like crisis is above the enhanced behavioral homes, and then there might be another home under that. I mean, that's the thing, is parents don't really know what the options are out there. You're saying it's a conversation with the service coordinator. So that means that would be up to the service coordinator to tell the parents what's out there. But there's got to be something out there that parents can look at.
There is. When I referenced the department safety net plan, they released the original one, I think 2 years ago. Gosh, time gets mushy when you're sitting at this desk. They released their original one a couple of years ago. They released an updated one January 10th of this year, and I'd be happy to share with you the links that you can get out to your members.
That would be great. Thank you.
I'll make a quick note to myself to get that to you.
Thank you.
No problem.
So next question, if I have a 2-bedroom addition to my home with its own entrance, bathroom, and kitchenette, would that qualify as a setting for supported living services? And how much discretion does a regional center have to say no to an SLS setting?
It really depends, and I apologize that that's the answer for a lot of these questions. You know, the regulations for supported living say something along the lines of that the home has to be separate from the home of the family member. It really comes down to, does the individual have control of the setting? And that's the biggest consideration.
Okay, thank you. And do we know the number of regional center consumers who are homeless or at risk for being homeless? For example, at risk for displacement due to group home closures, rent hikes, staff loss, etc.
I can tell you that one of the things that our system does really well is ensuring that people don't go unsheltered. When we have done a run of data for the 350,000 people being supported, just a couple hundred were unsheltered. What we have a harder time getting our hands around, quite honestly, is kind of the second part of that question. Who are those people who are at risk for displacement? Because we know there's different levels of homelessness. There are the people who are unsheltered, there are the people who are living in kind of temporary settings, and that may be in an informal temporary setting. It may be, you know, living with family when that's not the choice. And our data just isn't very sensitive to that. One of the questions on what's called our CEDAR, which is a database that regional centers enter information into, and at each IPP meeting, they update for each person, is, do you like where you're living? Do you want to live someplace else? And unfortunately, the way that questionnaire is structured, it doesn't ask that question of people who are living in maybe with their families. So we have difficulty discerning if someone's living with their family, is that a choice or is that out of necessity because other options just aren't open to them? So in terms of a big macro level, we have difficulty really estimating that accurately. But that's a great question.
And it would be great if I can go to the next slide. Okay, I don't know why I can't go to the next slide. Christina, can you see the next slide?
I can't see the next slide.
All right. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Regional center policy. Okay, great. Okay, so here's another question. So what can be done to make services equitable across regional centers? For example, respite hours for parents of children. SARC allocates a standard, I can't see the rest of that, for respite pretty much across the board for all levels of disability. A director's exception is gained. In RCEB, the standard is
30 hours.
I can't see how 30 hours a month in home for 21 days of camp / out of home. Shouldn't standards be the same across regional centers?
So one of the things that comes up oftentimes is this type of question. And a couple of things. First, back in 2004, the state did propose uniform purchase of service standards for regional centers. And I think we all kind of approached that from the perspective of, oh, this will be interesting, let's see what they've come up with. But when we dug into those standards, it really was not taking the most generous of all regional centers and packaging that together. It was really about cost savings and cost containment. So what I always encourage people to do is to really think about how to demonstrate the need that your loved one has. Every regional center purchase of service policy has an exception process. And so I would encourage you to think about what is the need that my child or my family has, and how do I demonstrate that, and how do I then seek that service out. And a lot of times this issue really comes down to identification of the need and then working together to figure out how to meet it. So when I was working for one regional center, I had a request come in for something like 100 hours a month of respite for an individual. And the initial response was, whoa, that's a lot of respite, right? But the more we dug into it, the more we realized that part of it was really daycare. It was to provide care while for an adult while their parent was working. Part of it was personal attendant care, and part of it was respite. So it really is looking at the need that your family has. What need isn't being met today, and then walking through that conversation in terms of what are the opportunities to meet that need.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think one of the things is that parents don't know what all the buzzwords are. They just know that they need help, and they don't know what the difference is between a personal attendant, code and a respite code, and a daycare code. They just know that they're drowning and they need help. And I think there's not all service coordinators, but are just are asking the parent what they want, and they should be really telling the parent the types of services that can help them out based on their need. So parents aren't as savvy as regional center case managers, and we really
absolutely appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I did just quickly want to add that there is a list of services available on DDS's website that goes through kind of the distinctions and some of the most commonly used services. I'd be happy to send you that link as well if that's helpful. Okay.
We're going to send this code out to all you guys that are watching the webinar, okay? We promise. The second question just kind of goes back to that first question I asked about the purchase of service money not utilized. Yeah. Now, is there a way, when money is sent back to the state, it shows that, oh, well, we don't need it. Everything's kind of going well, when we know that's not the case. So, is there a way that the data can be obtained from the different regional centers for the specific amount that was returned? So say SARC gave back this much money, Alta gave back this much money.
I'm thinking through that. And, one of the, I certainly understand the question. And I'm trying not to become too much of a policy wonk as I think through it. One of the challenges is that money is at the state level moved around between regional centers with some frequency throughout the fiscal year, because the way that budgeting is done is looking at kind of a broad swath of the state, and then the department, based on past spending, allocates the money to different regional centers according to trends and those sorts of things, with the expectation that adjustments will be made over time. So I see what you're asking. I don't know that that's the best way to get to that issue, and would certainly be interested in having more conversations about, what are the specific questions you're trying to answer with that, because sometimes the issue is that projections for an individual center just weren't on target at the state level, if that makes sense. So certainly willing to have more conversations about that, but not sure, but want to be as responsive to the underlying question as possible.
Okay. And maybe we can do something at Autism Society to see if we can get that information out and try to address this issue. Next slide, Christina.
So if we could generate 5 individuals with developmental,
500 individuals.
500 individuals with developmental disabilities and family members on the steps of the state capitol, what issue would you most like to see them rallying for?
I think first and foremost, Well, there's a couple of things. First and foremost, the biggest thing to do at the state capitol in terms of being heard is for not only families but individuals served by the system to tell their own stories. I was in a hearing this week, and it's remarkable that when families as well as people directly served by the system get up to tell their stories, legislators stop. They put down their pens, they put down their phones, and they tune in and they listen. And so talking about your experiences is really, really critical. I would love to see, you know, it was funny, one of the legislators at this hearing said, we don't hear the good stories. We only hear the people who, you know, are struggling in some way. And certainly appreciate that there's work to do in our system. There's work to do in every system, but would love to see people strike a balance in terms of the incredible value of this system in their lives. You know, of course, you know, we're always interested in people raising issues related to funding, and, you know, it's really impactful when people talk about every time my direct service provider or my regional center service coordinator changes, it's a problem for me because I feel like I have to retrain staff. It's not just about getting somebody in that chair, it's about some consistency in people's lives. But part of it is also saying, and here's why this system matters to me. Here's the promise I see in it. And sometimes we don't hear that as much. And it's not that I'm saying that the critique is unfair. It's just at times, you know, we hear from the administration, particularly the Department of Finance, that they're concerned about the cost escalations in the system. And so at times it can feel like we're a $9 billion system and the legislators aren't hearing that people really value it, that it really is impactful. And so it feels like finding a way to tell that story, to say, here's the potential that I see in my child, here's the potential that I see in my community in this service delivery system would probably be the number one thing I would push for.
So really couch it in with not just the critique, but say, look, here's what's working for my family right now and my child, and this is, you know, we can that get better. Also supply, you know, a list of issues of this is where we really need the help in order to have that continue.
Absolutely. And again, not asking people to be disingenuous in any way, but if there is a way to strike a balanced message, it does resonate with lawmakers about the importance of supporting not only this community, but this system.
Mm-hmm.
And then so we're getting close to wrapping up here, so maybe we'll just blow through the next questions really quickly. Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, so what are the ongoing and coordinated policy efforts between the large developmental disability advocacy organizations in California? We got a lot of action alerts, but it does not feel coordinated.
And that's a great point. We know that the more coordinated we are, the more singular our message, the more effective. There is a lot going on right now. I can tell you the Lanterman Coalition is focused right now on an implementation plan for the rate study, as well as correcting the service coordination shortfall. Other groups are also talking a lot about how to address, I think, the issue that you raised, Feda, around how to make sure that programs in high-cost areas are really considered, as well as what are those big outcomes that we're seeking as a system. And so I appreciate it can be confusing, that it can be a little overwhelming, and I do this for a living, and it can be overwhelming to me. We try through ARCA to provide action alerts in a way that we aren't sending them out as frequently as some other organizations, because we know that it can be confusing and that the toll it can take in terms of the time that people just don't have to give. So we try to be judicious about when we send them out, but those really are the big issues in the system today.
Okay. I'm going to kind of put two of these in one. So why is there a delay in implementing the Burns and Associates race study recommendations? And also what can be done to make sure that the newly formed stakeholder group fast tracks this process?
Quite honestly, the delay is, if I had to take a guess at it, it's the price tag. You know, when you're balancing a state budget, asking for an additional $1.8 billion is a significant ask. The Lanterman Coalition has put together kind of a 3-year implementation plan. And the other thing to remember in state government is that it's not just that our system would be seeking $1.8 billion. It's that, as I mentioned, other health and human services agencies programs, IHSS, a variety, Department of Rehab, all these other systems would also then say, potentially, hey, what about our service providers? What about, you know, some of the rate challenges that we have as well?
Okay, great. And last question, and I love this one. So any chance that the money saved from the DC closures and those buildings would provide adequate housing for our population?
I would love to see it. It's something that we've pushed for quite some time. I know that SEIU in particular is continuing to push on this issue, and it has happened in other states. The challenge in California is that in other states where it has happened, they have kind of a closed developmental disability system. So the amount of money that went into their community system was directly impacted by the cost to operate the developmental centers. Because our system has always been kind of separated, we've benefited to a degree in that the cost of running the developmental centers was never used as an excuse for not funding community services. But conversely, we're having a challenge getting over that hurdle in terms of saying, well, now money should flow the other direction. The Legislative Analyst's Office wrote a report on this last year and estimated the savings from the closure of the developmental centers to be somewhere around $100 million. And so, of course, it's something that we continue to push on. But in meeting with members of the administration, including finance, they look at developmental centers as a piece of state property, you know, sort of like a DMV office. And so love to see it, would love to do it. And it's an incredible hill.
Okay, well, that's all the time that we have now. Thank you so much, Amy, for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone that watched and all the questions that came in. Great questions. So again, this is the first in our spring series. We're going to have another one on February 6th with Steve Keisman of Ident4, and I'll be talking about jobs and things like that for people with developmental disabilities. All right, great. Thank you again so much, guys. And you'll get an email soon letting you know when the webinar is up. Thank you. Take care, everyone.